Now we are prepared to start this, as Hannah just said, the most important session on the MR Days about food, climate change, and our future. My name is Louise Lindfors. I'm Secretary General for Afrikagrupperna, and we arranged this together with FIAN. And the topic is alarming and very important, as you all know. The seminar will be going on like this. We will first have brief introductions from different levels of this issue. And then we will have a panel discussion with all participants. And I'll introduce them as you sit. So it's Hanna Dahlström, who is head of secretariat at FIAN, Sverige. And we have Matilde Bonaus from UNAC in Mozambique. União Nacional de Campones. Yes. And you also placed your bulletin over there. So we have a fresh report from Afrikagrupperna called the Fröaktionen for further reading, and also the bulletin from UNAC. And then we have Malin, turn page. Jonell, who is a researcher at Stockholm Resilience Center and also part of the Eat Lancet Commission. And to my right, Joanna Burke, who is a researcher at the Geneva, sorry for the Geneva Academy, yes. And you will get further introduced in your own presentations. But I think, Matilde, it's really interesting to have you here from all the way from Mozambique, and you will be able to give us a brief insight into the food production and the climate change effects on this from the reality in Mozambique. So please share with us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Louise. As I said before, my name is Matilde Bonaus. I'm advocacy officer at UNAC, União Nacional de Camponeses, in Mozambique. Mozambique is located in southern Africa. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity. Yeah, you're right, we traveled all around. I came with my colleague, she's there. And yes, it's been a pleasure since we arrived here on Monday, very early. And since then, we've been doing very interesting things. I would like first to say that, well, about the reflection on how farmers' experience is now affected by the climate change. And I would like to say that we are severely facing the climate change effects, and this is affecting the farm as well. First, for example, we have schedules like, okay, 15 October will rain, so the peasants could go to the fields and put the seeds on the soil. And now things are different. Now can rain like in the middle of August, in the middle of June, in the middle of May, and don't rain in October, so things are mixed up. And this is affecting severely because we are facing the hunger situations. And this in the past didn't happen in this magnitude that's happening now. But this also due to some actions that we as human we do like every day. For example, we pollute the soil with the fertilizers, with the all chemicals, and this somehow also affects the all things like the nature and yeah. For this, the possible change that we would have to do and to ensure a sustainable production, as UNAC, we have this approach, the agroecological way of producing. And this approach is giving much more results than we expected. because since the peasants, the Yunak peasants and the other that are not members, that they are sympathetic with Yunak, they are implementing this way of producing in ecologic way, and the results are there. Like in the places, for example, in the northern part of the country, there were soils that weren't like too productive anymore, because in the past they were being this how can I say this encouragement of using too many chemicals like fertilizers and etc. And the soils got into being not productive. So with this approach, the peasants started to produce in an agroecological way, and now the soils are productive. So yeah, it's possible to go around this situation. It's just a matter of changing our own way of thinking and accepting new ideas. Yes, thank you very much. I don't know if I still have time or...
Oh, you still have time if you want to say something about also, we will touch upon the food production, and you mentioned now the agroecological methods that are in practice, but are also threatened, right?
Yeah.
Both due to different initiatives that might be connected to both development cooperation, but also national initiatives in how to industrialize agriculture, and also, as you mentioned, the effects of climate change. Do you have any reflections on those two areas a little bit before we...
Yes, I do. Thank you very much. Implementing this approach is not easy. It's not being easy, because we are facing adversaries, not also by the government policies and program, but also from the big companies. Because the big companies are coming in Mozambique, like many of them, either for like monocultures, and either for mining, and either for any kind of soil exploitation. And this is also taken to the land grabbing of peasants. We have many cases of land grabbing. One of the biggest ones was the green resources. I don't know if you heard about it, the plantation of eucalyptus. Yeah, and also we have the other one is Port-to-Sale, and now we are in this fight against the pro-savanna implementation. So these are just one of the examples of initiatives that comes through big companies and with the acknowledgement of the government. So in this fight, we will have to, we are joined the effort with another civil society organizations in Mozambique. We have platforms, and we do have also partners around the world. For example, about the pro-savanna, the civil society in Japan, we are working together. Actually, in this year, there was a big conference that a peasant from the northern part of the country, he went there to represent the Mozambican peasants. And also in the recent past, a few colleagues of mine from UNAC, because we did this research, it's just I forgot to take the document. We did this research with another civil society organization about the green resources, and we took that research and as UNAC and the other civil society organizations, and we went to Noruega, and we presented the parliament there and the politicians there, and they were like surprised because they didn't know that the money they were giving was creating damages and some very harmful difficulties in Mozambican peasants. So that was one of the very heated way of fighting against this. And from that action, the budget that was being given to the program has been drastically reduced. And I forgot the name, but one of the head guys of the organizations there in Oregon, he just quit his job. So yeah, these are some, just to say that the alliances abroad are very helpful to show and you know, spread the fight along.
The awareness, yeah.
Yes, the awareness.
Well, thank you. And Hanna, FIAN recently launched a report, Women's Power in Food Struggle, discussing these challenges and also solutions of the right to food in the food system. Oh, you have it there. Wow, that's so great. And connecting to the experience that Matilde mentioned now in UNAC, what findings are there in the report, and are there similarities?
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, FIAN is a global international human rights organization. Sorry.
Did you get an important phone call?
No.
Thank you.
Just for the image. FIAN was the world's first international human rights organization for the right to food. And we work in alliances also with the global small peasant movement. But I wanted to bring back the conversation also to food, to just say clearly that what this report talks about, how food is part of nature, also part of meaning making in cultures, how we need to keep this in mind, and food is a human right that should be available to everyone, and we know it isn't today. So it wasn't the report, which has a very beautiful cover. It was a collective work done by not only FIAN, but also a Right to Food network, which is a network of social movements and other organizations and researchers. And it's called Women's Power in Food Struggles. And it asks more uncomfortable questions, I think, about relations of power. So using intersectional feminist analysis, but that means basically looking at power relations from different types of identities, class, gender, location. And it asks the very big questions: who is hungry, and who produces food, and why? And so what we know is that women are the most hungry, often go hungry, are the majority of the hungry in the world, yet they're also the majority of the food producers today in the world. So it's this paradox. And women are central to producing food, right? Everything from breastfeeding to cooking, and in many cultures this role, as we know here in Sweden as well, is often unpaid work, reproductive work. And so the report talks about the problems that these movements see, and I think this relates to your discussion and presentation regarding what is going on with the climate, but also what kind of agricultural model is the dominant one that's being promoted, and that this dominant model is also dominating nature and extracting important nutrients from the food, from the soil, and depending on fossil fuels, depending on, that requires use of pesticides. But it's not only like a technological issue, it's also an issue of power, like who has then the power to use these pesticides, who the farmers have to buy patented seeds from. And it shows that the importance of a human rights-based approach. And there are these approaches, like also you mentioned, agroecology, the global peasant movements and indigenous. People talk about food sovereignty. So beyond the right to food, the right to be able to decide over how we produce our food, what kind of food, culturally relevant, adequate food, And that's ecologically just, and I think, but the very important part of this report is that not just ecologically just. Usually we talk about sustainability, we think about nature, but we don't think about the social aspect of sustainability. And that also relates to, I think this report is called Women's Power, but it also relates to how, for example, in many parts of the world right now, in authoritarian systems that threaten the right to food, also threaten other important human rights, such as gender diversity, which we can see right now in Brazil, for example, but also here at home, right? Yeah. Yeah, the report is, I recommend looking into it. It's called Watch 2019, so if you search for FIAN and Watch 2019. Yeah.
Thank you.
That was some of my main
main points. We'll also be able to further elaborate thoughts and discussions in the panel discussion. But we'll continue with you. It's actually Dr. Joanna Burke. I'm sorry for the missing out on the title. And you're Senior Research Fellow at Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. That's the full title. But your background is on international law, and I know that you also focused a lot in your research now on that UN declaration that has much connections to what we're talking about right now. There are many interesting things to discuss here. The language, also terminology between food sovereignty and food security, and the UN language is a very important factor within this rights area. Could you please give us some insight in that area?
Sure. Thank you, Louise. I'm going to be a little bit of the dry academic who comes in after some wonderful presentations. And what I wanted to do is just briefly outline some of the normative elements around the right to food, which Hannah has also just spoken about. So when we talk about the right to food in international human rights law, we're talking about interrelated sets of rights that articulate both with other economic, social and cultural rights, but also with civil and political rights. So there is this interrelationship between all of the human rights. We're talking particularly about the right to produce food. So here we're talking about the rights of people working in agriculture, and that includes rights to land, to natural resources such as seeds and water, and the right to decent work, as well as the right to social security. So they're all interconnected, and these are part of the right to food that need to be looked at as an ensemble. And these are all elements of the right to food that are being impacted by climate change. We can see that very clearly. This framework has been well developed, both within the United Nations human rights system. So we have the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights that has a recognition of the right to food. We also have a United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to food that is responsible for developing normative standards and also overseeing implementation of the right to food, carrying out country visits. And then we have the UN FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, that has adopted a huge number of standard-setting instruments like the voluntary guidelines on the right to food, voluntary guidelines on the governance of land tenure. And each of these instruments advances certain understandings of the right to food. So we talk about the key elements of accessibility of food, and that includes non-discrimination that Hannah has also highlighted, and FIAN highlights very strongly in the report. The availability of food, so food production and distribution systems, as well as the quality of food and those cultural elements of food and the cultural acceptability of food that are often underplayed. And that also includes issues of food safety, so use of chemicals and other things that may be harmful to human health that assume will be spoken about in a little bit. And then the element of sustainability. So the need to ensure that our agricultural practices, our food production practices are adequate for both present and future generations. And these are issues that are very, very important in the context of climate change, because we see that agriculture and our current models of agro-industrial production are extremely detrimental to the environment. And increasingly, we have initiatives like what Mathilde has spoken about, that UNAC and other peasants' movements are promoting, which really seek to change and challenge that model of agro-industrial production. So that brings me to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas, which was adopted by the United Nations Human Rights Council in September of 2018, and then by the UN General Assembly in December of 2018. And it was really a preoccupation with challenges and threats to the right to food that drove the adoption of that normative instrument at the United Nations level. So peasants' rights movements had been working on declaratory documents for 17 years prior to the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants, and it was really something that was from the ground up. It was really promoted by peasants' rights movements from around the world coming together, but the push that the instrument was given was the food price crisis of 2008, 2009, when it was seen that the volatility in commodities markets, in food prices, were having an impact on hunger and malnutrition around the world and people's ability to feed themselves. And there it was seen that there was going to be support to support peasant agriculture and the identity of peasants. So, as I mentioned, the declaration was the fruit of 17 years of struggle by rural social movements, and it recognizes the identity of the peasant. It reappropriates that identity because very often, particularly in English-speaking countries, the word peasant is seen as something that's pejorative, and there was an attempt to provide value to that, to show that peasants contribute to sustainable food production. That they have a special relationship to land, to water, to nature, and that they're facing risks of violence and violations of their human rights that include things like what Mathilde was speaking about, eviction and land and resource grabbing, hazardous working conditions, and political repression. So defenders of peasants' rights have also been subjected to violence and repression. And the declaration reiterates these interrelated protections for a variety of human rights, including the right to food, the right to education, the right to health. And it also sets new standards for individual and collective rights over land and natural resources, the right to seeds, which is very important, the right to biodiversity, which again is something that's increasingly important in a context of climate change, and also this notion of food sovereignty that Louise mentioned previously, which is a developing concept in international law, the notion that people should be able to control both food production, consumption, and really that whole value chain around food. And as I mentioned, there was an involvement of diverse groups in the process of the development of this declaratory instrument. Feminist peasant constituencies were particularly active in pushing for the adoption of the declaration. And it really positions smallholder farmers, principles of agroecology and biodiversity at the front and center of ways of doing agriculture and producing food that are more sustainable than the neoliberal agro-industrial systems that are currently the norm.
And Dr. Malin Jonell, also present from a research perspective, but also in other capacity. At the Eat Lancet Commission, you have the purpose to define a healthy reference diet and define planetary boundaries, as well as applying a global food system modeling framework. And you have been focusing on how to achieve a great food transformation and a planetary health diet for 10 billion people. What are the challenges and what are your strategies?
This is, of course, a huge topic.
Yeah.
So I think I'm the second dry academic here. And well, to start from the beginning, I'm a biologist by training and a sustainability scholar. And the reason I'm excited about food is that food really lies at the heart of both planetary health and human health. And I would like to start with traveling back in time to 1955 around, where the great acceleration started, where human activities started causing an exponential pressure on the Earth system level. And those activities include everything from land use in agriculture, fishing, emissions of greenhouse gas emissions, but also volumes of food produced. Since the 1965, we've increased the volume of food produced on planet Earth threefold. So, I mean, this is an enormous achievement in some ways, but as we all know, it also has very many negative consequences, and it makes us sick as humans, and it also makes the planet sick in many ways. And food is one of the main drivers on pressures on our planetary boundaries. It accounts for around 25% of greenhouse gas emissions, 70% of water consumption globally, and a substantial portion of emissions of eutrophying substances, and et cetera, and biodiversity loss, land use. So it's really one of the most important activities, and I think what I represent in this planet is more the global perspective and looking at this from a little bit from above. And I would like to tell you a little bit more about what we did in this Eat Lancet Commission. It was a commission by The Lancet, the medical journal, and it was compiled of a group of 20 top researchers, not including me. I was part of a secretariat working with a report with these top senior experts in agriculture, nutrition, epidemiology, biodiversity, etc. And the report was launched in January this year and got quite a lot of attention globally. So what we did was that we did two separate things. First, we defined what is a healthy diet only from the perspective of the human body. So the planetary health diet is a little bit misleading, I think, because the diet was only set from a human health perspective. And then we set food planetary boundaries. So we looked at the planetary boundaries defined for all human activities on planet Earth. And then we defined what is a reasonable portion that food can account for if we are to stay within the safe zone of these planetary boundaries by 2050. And then in the third step, we combined the two. So we run this model, this global model, and looked at can we stay within the planetary boundaries and still produce this healthy diet for 10 billion people? Is it even possible? And the downside was that, well, just changing to this diet will not be enough. And just to tell you a little bit more of the diet, how different is it from what we eat today? So one of the major things is that we recommend globally a substantial reduction of red meat consumption, and essentially ruminant meats, so beef and mutton and sheep's. All the and we also suggest, we recommend a substantially increased intake in vegetables, pulses, and nuts, and healthy oils. So that is like basically what it's all about. And in Sweden, the greatest change here is to move away from animal-sourced foods. On the African continent, the situation is different. There, the intake of animal-sourced foods can essentially stay or even be increased slightly. But what we need there is a reduction of intake of starchy vegetables and an increase of leafy greens, pulses, good grains, millets, different crops that can grow on the continent, so just to give an African perspective. But on the positive side from this modeling exercise was that if we implement a substantial dietary shift globally, we also improve production practices. And this means, for instance, more efficient use of natural resources. Agroecology is a great example, but we can also, if we look globally at nutrient use, for instance, we need to decrease use in our part of the world, like we talk about artificial fertilizer, but we should and can possibly and likely increase in other parts, and the African continent is one example. And the third intervention would be to halve food loss and waste. Today, 1/3 of the food we produce is lost on the production step, in the steps in between, and on the consumer side. So there we can make a huge difference.
I'm so happy that you're already into solutions, because that's basically what, when we have venues like this, people from the audience want to have, like, okay, what can I do in my daily practice, and how can I change, and what can I do? And of course, Afrikagrupperna is also launching a report. I couldn't be worse than you guys. So, and this is just fresh from the print, actually, and I'm thinking that all the things you touch upon in your different, from your different perspectives, is the trigger point is actually civil society and the possibilities to take action and put pressure on politics globally. So I think even though being a small NGO is a very important agent of change within this. But I would like to turn to you now, Matilda, and ask you a little bit about what is, if we're in regards to this very intricate and complicated chains of different dependency, different fundings, political initiatives, etc., globally, there seems to be if we counted on it, everything would be sum zero. We would have enough food for everyone. And there are methods, as you mentioned, like agroecological methods that do not restrain the limits of our global environment. How come this is still a problem? And specifically, I would like to ask you about the seed issue, because that's what we have focused on a lot. Together with UNAC, Afrikagrupperna has done this seed campaign, the Fröaktionen, in order to mobilize and educate about the seed question. Could you tell us a little bit about the seed, and what is the challenges when it comes to hybrid seed and native seeds, etc.?
Okay, thank you very much, Louise. Actually, it's been quite interesting, like here, this panel, as you said, has too many different perspectives, and somehow they are all very connected, and it's quite very interesting. Well, about your question, UNAC's approach is the healthy food, okay? And we are developing this program of native seeds, the rescue, the multiplication, and the conservation and control the native seeds by the peasants. Because we do believe that, yes, as you said, they might have ways of producing food like to everyone, but will it be healthy food? That's the question. It's not about the food, it's what type of food. And as Dr. Merlin was saying here about the healthy diet, you know, and we do believe that the native seeds, they have much more, how can I say it, proteins, ingredients, like the things that can keep us healthy. Because they are natural. They don't suffer any kind of modification and etc. And they grow like naturally. You don't need to put fertilizers and such of things that are harmful, not also for the human, but also for the soil. As a human, the consumer, and also the person that's going to produce, and they use the fertilizer because it will annihilate and something else. So yeah, we are developing this program of the native seeds because the first approach is that we do believe that these ones are the healthier, okay? And not also because are healthier, but they are very easy to be manageable, managed by the peasants. You know, our grandparents, they were using native seeds. They didn't have problems of keeping the seed for the next season, but the hybrid and modified one, you cannot keep for the other season. You need to buy it like every season. And for example, in Mozambique, in most part of African countries, the agriculture is for sustainability. It's like produce to eat. It's not like producing to sell. Major part of the production goes to the family, and just the other part is sold just to buy some clothes, sugar, oil, and things paying school kids, those kind of stuff. So we do believe that this approach is perfect for the peasants, because it's, as Dr. Was saying, like the reports also saying, like the way that they produce. Okay, so they are used to produce in that way. So we won't have to modify anything like, oh, you need to do this and do that. No. And the other thing is that they are also resilient to the climate change. Can I have the remote to show the pictures here, please?
Yes, because we can also mention, like on a political level, the hybrid seeds are also, I mean, they are promoted by multinational companies that today control more or less 63% of the global agricultural market. And of course, that also creates this dependency from the peasant towards that company to buy the new hybrid seeds every year, and also the pesticides and all the chemicals that you need in order to protect the seeds, since they are more vulnerable to climate change, as you mentioned.
Yes, and the peasants, they don't have the money to buy all those things. And the money that they get from the sale is just for that kind of needs. They don't have extra money to buy seeds, to buy fertilizers, and etc. And also, in that budget, you need to include the healthy part, because you're gonna get sick. So you need to have a saving for, you know, hospital and etc. And in Africa, we have those healthy problems, like the hospital is too far, and etc. etc. So this kind of seed, it's clearly that they don't adapt in our way of living. We do believe that there will be some part of in the world that people might accept this, but for us, it's not even adaptable, it's not even productive, it's not even healthy. So we don't believe that those industrial seeds are better. Look, this picture is my colleague, she's here, Lucinda. She was working in her field after the cyclone Idai. So what's happening now, the peasants are trying to recover the soil. First, they took that sand that was brought by the waters, etc. And now they are preparing the soil and fertilizing with cows and chickens, excrements, and also composters, like, And this is the place that they save their seeds. Okay, so because she's also
seed bank.
It's a seed bank. It's the seed bank. Those seeds were produced by the peasants of her area, because she's also president of a local UNAC structure. So those are seeds, and they are going to more than 100 peasants. Okay, so they produced it, they multiplied the seed, and those are the seeds that are going to for more than 100 peasants. Although they faced the Idai cyclone, you can see that the seeds resisted. Imagine if they were like the modified seed, they wouldn't resist at all. So that's one of the proofs that we have here. That's her in her field. It's just going to that approach, like the big companies. We do face that the big companies are going to our country. I mean, they are already there. But the thing is we are creating an awareness and a consciousness in our peasants to go to the native seeds, because they also face the ones that they were not members of UNAC. They are coming to UNAC because they saw that the others one that are members, they are getting some productivity. For example, Some peasants, they bought seeds for a company, I forgot the name, and none of the seed had germinated. So they just lost their money, and the company didn't want to give back the money. They said, that's not our fault. You just bought the seeds. There's no return. There's no refundable. And they were so mad. So this kind of evidences that also the companies, they just go for the money, you know, go for the money. If the soil will be no productive anymore, they don't care, because the other company, even they can have like, there might be the same company like sell seeds, sell fertilizers. So it's a chain, okay? But the peasants are caught in the middle, and they don't have nowhere to go, because if they buy hybrid seeds, they will have to buy fertilizer, because with the fertilizers, the seed won't germinate. I don't know if you get me. So the point is that they are most part of the Mozambican peasants, they are aware of this. So that's why we are going in the agroecologic way of producing. And thank God now we are, because we're going in that basic local approach, and we are also intervene in the political way, advocating. We are part of platforms like National Platform of Seed, and we are also work with the government in those platforms. We propose our agenda, and for example, the next nutritional and sustainable program, they are those kind of our ideas, UNAC's ideas, like native seeds, agroecologic way of producing, because they are nutritive. And we also have programs like in the associations, like moms, they gather, and after how can I say, a harvest, they gather and they produce like meal, the porridge meal, things, and give the hospital the babies. And there are some, for example, in the center part of the country, we recovered 5 babies that were malnutrition suffering. They were about to die, and now they're alive. So this kind of examples are live examples that show that native seeds is not just about the thing that the peasants are get used to, about the advantages that this kind of producing way is giving to us.
Thank
Yes.
you. And from your presentation and your very strong witness, it's obvious that the feminist perspective is hugely important within the approach for reaching agroecological methods. But perhaps you could elaborate a little bit of your findings also in the report about the linkages between feminism and agroecology.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think the feminist analysis, to me, is like an analysis of power, no? Which is this report talks about. And for example, which you mentioned here very clearly, like food being a commodity. Here we're talking about food as a human right. What does that mean? What's the difference between food only being a commodity in a system of food production that's a dominant capitalist agricultural model that is also related to depending on dispossession of land and extractivism, no, of fossil fuels, because we need that model requires fossil fuels to produce food, and so I think that there's some clear linkages between the feminist analysis. I mean, here at home we talk about, and globally now we talk about Greta Thunberg as a leader, no, for doing something in this climate crisis. And globally, there are a lot of Gretas, no. For example, the people that are resisting, for example, land possession, land grabbing cases, like you mentioned, how land grabbing is a part of this issue in relation to how we produce our food. because then land is the commodity. Beyond land being something that should be produced for food, land is only seen as a commodity. So, and I wanted to connect it also to not only the people that are the Gretas and social movements that are fighting out there, but also to what we can do back here in Sweden, because for example, FIAN is part of this campaign called Just Pensions, Schyssta Pensioner, where we link and we look at, okay, what is the responsibility of Swedish state pension investments? How are they linked, for example, to these land-grabbing cases that impose violence on the communities and on nature? And this is also the feminist analysis of this report is the domination of nature, no? Not only domination of certain people, women or others, but also dominating nature. So I think that there's a lot of initiatives here at home, so I think it's important for us to listen and connect, right, what's happening in the world and globally, but how are actually because it's our tax money, supporting some of these and not helping to promote like an agroecological food production model. So yeah, I wanted to invite people to join our campaigns for this, to change the investments.
Thank you. I know that Afrikagrupperna is also very active in that campaign, so yeah, that's hugely important. Joanna, do you have any comment regarding social movements and the possibility to take a stance and affect the global politics from that perspective?
Definitely, and I think that, as we've alluded to here, social movements are using discourses and instruments of human rights increasingly, and I think that those discourses and also the obligations that are entailed within human rights guarantees are incredibly important, because they bring into focus these relationships between humans and nature as well. Increasingly, we're trying to marry those two agendas around sustainability to ensure that there is also attention being paid to the environmental consequences of activities along with the human rights consequences. So I think there very much social movements are focused on core elements of human rights frameworks like participation, free, prior and informed consent. So participation includes participation in the design of policies, in the implementation of the policies, also in their monitoring and follow-up, and pointing out these incoherences between different legal frameworks. If we have a trade system that is built on liberalizing trade, an intellectual property system that allows for individual corporate rights over seeds to trump the human rights of smallholders to conserve and use peasant or ancestral varieties of seeds, then the human rights framework allows us to point out those inconsistencies and to enable us to better advocate to change them. And also to bring different stakeholders to the table. That intersectional analysis that FIAN has been promoting, that feminist form of thinking, is also something that we're getting better at within the human rights movement too, of saying, okay, we need to form these alliances, we need to look at what the common problems are at different scales, and to link up, to use our voice collectively. And then obviously these issues of accountability, so looking at how we hold states accountable for the consequences on the right to food of particular modes of agricultural production, but also for the environmental consequences, looking at how we can better hold corporations to account. And there are moves underway, and certainly social movements have been vital in pushing towards a binding treaty at the international level on business and human rights, pushing also for national action plans that would talk about business and human rights and how we can better regulate business there, and the adoption of human rights due diligence legislation for corporations at the national level. So they're all concrete actions that have come out of social movement action and participation, and they're showing that there are solutions that are there. You know, and this particular focus also on non-discrimination and equality, which I think is crucial, because we're showing that it's not necessarily about producing more food at all costs. What it is about is democratizing food systems, ensuring that... Okay, well,
it disappeared.
Yeah, maybe that's...
You said some very radical things
We
there.
still we
Democratizing
have
food
only
systems.
we have 5 more minutes, so I
you're
think we'll
cut.
just move on to your reflection, and maybe then from a more individual perspective, like what can we as citizens and as individuals affect in this? And you already touched upon some interesting findings. Of course, eat more vegetables,
Yeah.
but are there other ways that you could recommend?
Yeah, well, just to start from a slightly different angle, but I'll come back to the individual and us as consumers. But I think the shift that we suggest in this Eat Lancet report is something that humanity has never, ever experienced before. And I mean, it's an alarming case of food production today and what it does to our planet and our health. So what we need to do has never been done before, and there is no scientific evidence on how to do this. But I think business as usual is not an option. And I think what's been touched upon already by Matilda and Joanna is this refocusing on from volume to quality. So to look more on what is good for our health and refocus on crops that has not been focused on before. I'm also coming more from the aquatic side, actually. I'm a fisheries aquaculture person, and I think the role of aquatic foods, algae, small fish, etc., can also be hugely important. And before getting to the consumers, I just want to take 2 other examples that I think is very important. One is the role of governments. Governments they need to start governing the food system. They need to be more brave when it comes to hard policies such as refocused subsidies, taxes on unhealthy and unsustainable foods. And they also can be more brave when it comes to working towards the private sector and markets. One example is Chile, that has implemented warning labels on unhealthy food, like black little circles, and also forbidden advertising of unhealthy food for children younger than 14. And they also forbidden different figures that appeal to children, like the Frosty's tiger and Happy Meal, all forbidden. So it's like a radical shift. And I think we also need, I mean, besides the civil society that's been represented in this panel, and I think in the room in general, I think we also need to work more with the private sector. The big companies have potentially, it's really all hands on deck at this stage. So I think we also need to push them and also incentivize them to take a lead in this big transformation. So finally, on to the consumers then. So I think what we need to do in our part of the world is to radically shift away from the worst animal-sourced foods. We can eat a little bit of meat a week and at more festive occasions, but I think in general, this is the most radical thing that we can do. And yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone, for these amazing and interesting contribution on this very huge and alarming topic of food and climate aspects on our food production and human rights aspect on this. And of course, from Afrikagrupperna's perspective, I think also the engagement of the general public, like people like you and me, can have a huge importance within this. And the more you interact and engage in the seminars like this, and the more you learn about these questions, the more possibilities you have to both make the choices for yourself and to affect and push for change on different levels. And for a governmental perspective, of course, it's super important that our governments listen in and also use their power within the relations in development cooperation as well. So that's the focus in our campaign, the Seed Action, to to promote that our politicians that are elected from the Swedish public do take that responsibility in the connections with the rest of the world in these global issues. So we have collected now more than, I think, 7,000 signatures from Swedish people, and now we're adding on in this next phase. I think we're up on about 3,000 or 4,000 signatures at Fröaktionen, where we push for this specific area, that we should use our common funds and our common political commitment to push for the right things. So agroecologic farming, and also the feminist perspective within this. And this dialogue can of course continue. I know FIAN has a stand, Afrikagrupperna has a stand, so please feel free to join with us in conversations in new constellations. But our time is out here on this stage, so a huge thank you to all the panelists for the amazing contributions, and thank you for all who joined us.